One message, one evening, one action, and my whole life was split in half. You definitely don't expect how it all ended. You wait for the end because everything becomes clear there. I used to believe I could spot every lie in her eyes. It was something I quietly prided myself on, a skill born out of years of closeness, of studying the subtle shifts in her expressions and voice. But nothing about that day in downtown Denver prepared me for the moment when Liana walked right past my car and got into someone else's without hesitation. She wore her navy coat, the one she always said made her feel professional and powerful, and those tall boots I bought her for our anniversary last fall. I was parked just a few yards from the hotel's revolving doors. She stepped out laughing into the crisp evening air, scanning the row of vehicles. For a second, our eyes almost met. But she turned her head too quickly and climbed into a sleek black car with Texas plates. That's when I saw the driver's hand reach across and rest, casually, familiarly, on her thigh. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't honk, didn't call. I just watched until the car disappeared into traffic. Then I pulled away, silent as stone. I drove home in a trance, the engine humming low under the weight of everything I didn't want to believe. Our kids were already asleep, their lunch boxes laid out on the kitchen counter for Monday. I didn't wait up for her like I usually did. I didn't even text to ask where she was. For the first time in 10 years of marriage, I let her absence echo through the house unchecked. The next morning she returned as if nothing happened. Her voice was soft, casual, and warm, like always, offering to make coffee, asking how I slept. But her suitcase was heavier than usual, and while she was upstairs changing, I noticed something odd tucked between her folded blouses. A white box from a boutique jeweler. Inside was a necklace and matching bracelet, both still tagged. The price nearly made my stomach turn. I'd never seen them before. I'd never given them to her, and she hadn't bought herself anything like that in years. I closed the box without touching a thing. At lunch, I packed the kids into the SUV, told her I was taking them to visit my sister for the weekend. She nodded slowly, a flicker of uncertainty behind her carefully controlled expression, but I said nothing more. I drove out of the neighborhood without a backward glance. That weekend at my sister's place was quiet but heavy. The kids played with their cousins, unaware of the tidal shift happening in our family. I tried to act normal, laughed at their jokes, helped build a pillow fort in the living room. But when night came, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling fan, turning over the memory of that black car again and again, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I saw. But I had. Every moment was burned into my brain with cruel precision. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a single message. I need to explain. I returned home after sunset. The house smelled like old wine and lavender-scented candles, a scent she often used to calm herself. I found her curled on the bathroom floor, her eyes red and glassy. The half-empty bottle of Pinot on the counter said enough. She looked at me like she'd been waiting years for me to open that door. She mumbled through sobs that it wasn't what I thought, that the man in the car was just an old friend from college, that she didn't think I'd see. She clutched at the hem of my sleeve, repeating that it meant nothing. And then, through a hiccup of breath and broken pride, she said the words that shifted something deep inside me. I thought you'd never find out. That was the moment I left. No yelling, no dramatic exit, just silence. I walked into our daughter's room, took down her favorite drawing, the one of all four of us holding hands beneath a sun with a heart in it, and slipped it into my coat. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out. I moved what little I needed into a rented garage unit across town. It was dusty, drafty, and filled with the smell of old oil and cardboard, but I made it livable. I slept on a camping mat, surrounded by my old boxes from college and work. The flickering bulb above barely warmed the place, but I didn't care. I turned off my phone, changed my number, cut off everything. It wasn't out of spite. I just needed the quiet. I needed to feel something real again. The days blurred together after that. I picked the kids up from school on my days, dropped them off without crossing paths with her. She started showing up at the daycare unannounced, asking questions, trying to find out where I was staying, but I'd already transferred my accounts to another bank, locked away important documents, even deleted all my social media profiles. My friends knew not to give her any details. I wanted a clean break, even if I hadn't quite figured out what would come next. In that vacuum of confusion and fury, I turned back to something I hadn't touched in years: rock climbing. I joined a community group that trained in the canyons on weekends, many of them volunteers working with teens from rough homes. We taught them ropes, safety knots, how to fall and rise again. One girl, barely 13, had her mom's eyes but no trust in anyone. Watching her climb, daring herself 1 inch higher every time, shook something in me. I imagined my own daughter 10 years from now, doubting people the same way, wondering if love was ever honest. That was the moment I realized I hadn't let go of anything. I was still dragging it all behind me like an anchor. 40 feet off the ground, my hands numb and my legs aching, I whispered something I never thought I'd say: I won't forgive. That night I sent Liana a message. Cold, clear, unambiguous. You're no longer the center of my life. And yet I knew this wasn't the end. Not even close. The message I sent wasn't designed to hurt her. It wasn't a threat. Wasn't even anger wrapped in words. It was simply a truth I needed to say out loud. And yet it shook the foundation of whatever fragile illusion she was still clinging to. She didn't text back, at least not immediately. But 2 days later, she came looking. It was a Thursday. The gym buzzed with activity, chalk dust in the air, the smell of sweat, rubber, and challenge. I was halfway through a warm-up climb when I noticed the commotion at the front desk. A voice too loud, too sharp, cutting through the ambient energy of the place. I knew that tone. My hands tightened around the hold. Liana stood just past the entrance, her eyes scanning the gym until they locked onto me. Her hair was pulled back in that way she always did when things got serious, but her eyes were wild, something between panic and determination. She walked straight through the crowd and yelled my name like she owned it. People turned. I dropped down from the wall. Before I could even speak, she exploded. Accusations, explanations, begging laced with confusion. She asked why I was doing this, why I wouldn't let her talk, why I disappeared like she hadn't been part of my life for a decade. Her words spilled over one another, her voice cracking, echoing off the walls. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't want to say it here. Then something I didn't expect happened. Jane, the climbing coach, stepped between us. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was solid. Jane had been around since I started coming here again. Ex-military, calm under pressure, always watching more than speaking. She and I had shared a few quiet lunches, most of them filled with long pauses and unspoken stories. She looked at Liana and said with quiet certainty, "This isn't the place for that." Liana tried to brush past her, and in the next breath, she raised her hand and slapped Jane. A crisp sound, sharp as a bell. The gym fell silent. Seconds later, someone had already called the cops. I didn't move. I just stood there while Liana got escorted outside, her voice rising in disbelief, her eyes on me like I was the stranger. They took her in for the night. I didn't ask for it, didn't stop it. I went back to the wall, climbed another route. That evening, as I came down from a difficult pitch, my arms shaking from effort, I saw Jane again, waiting at the bench with 2 cups of coffee. She didn't say a word when I sat beside her. We just watched the sky deepen through the gym's windows, the orange clouds dissolving into violet. For the first time in weeks, I felt my chest loosen a little. I didn't jump into anything with Jane. It wasn't like that. But I couldn't ignore how quiet her presence was, how it didn't demand or pressure, how she never asked about my past, only ever spoke about the next step, the next climb, the next challenge. And in that stillness, I started to remember who I was before the ground cracked beneath my feet. Back at the garage, I rearranged my things to feel a little more like a home. I brought in a fold-out cot, a real pillow, even an old lamp from college that still flickered in the same familiar way. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My space. No false promises, no shadowed corners. On the weekends, I kept the rhythm for the kids. Saturday breakfast, cartoons, long walks to the creek near the school. I made up silly stories to make them laugh, built Lego castles that took up half the living room. And when they asked why Mommy wasn't coming with us, I said only what I had to. Truthful, but gentle. That we were working on being better parents, even if it meant not living in the same place. Liana didn't give up. She sent letters, long ones, about memories, about regrets, about how she never stopped loving me. Once she left a box of photos at my parents' house, filled with old family shots, our wedding, the kids as babies. She even included a printed email thread between her and the man in the black car, trying to show me it was a brief lapse, an accident, but I didn't read them. I carried the box to the garage and left it unopened on a high shelf. Not out of hate, out of choice. Every betrayal leaves a stain, not just on the moment itself, but on everything it touches after. And while I didn't burn the past, I no longer used it as a map. Instead, I poured my energy into something new. I started helping out at the school, not as a teacher, but as a project assistant, fixing things, helping with art supplies, organizing field trips. It gave me a reason to stay close to my kids' world without dragging in the heaviness of my own. Every Sunday, I took them to an old farm on the edge of town. A friend from the climbing group owned it, retired early, liked teaching city kids how to repair broken equipment. My son learned to take apart engines. My daughter learned to sand wood and stain it by hand. They came home with dirt under their nails and stories in their eyes. Meanwhile, Liana's presence started to fade from the day to day. She didn't stop trying, but I stopped letting it affect me. The space she once filled was now taken up by other things. My kids, the quiet of the garage, the climbs, the Sunday sunrises when my daughter fell asleep against my chest in the truck after a long day. But still, something waited under all of it, a shadow I didn't name, because the past never leaves quietly. It waits for the moment your guard drops, and that moment was closer than I thought. Some nights start with peace and end with fire. That one began with spaghetti and my daughter's never-ending knock-knock jokes. She had the flashlight beside her pillow again, the broken one she refused to give up. I kissed her goodnight and walked out, thinking the day was done. 3 hours later, I found her burning up. She was curled on her side, murmuring in her sleep, forehead hot as coals. The thermometer blinked 104.3. I grabbed a blanket, lifted her in my arms, told my son to get his shoes. In less than 10 minutes, we were on the road to the ER, her breath shallow against my chest the entire drive. At Mercy General, nurses move fast. I stood frozen as machines beeped and tubes were prepared. The quiet panic was louder than any scream, and that's when I broke my silence. I called Liana. She answered instantly. "She's sick," I said. "It's bad." 15 minutes later, she came through the doors like a storm. Hair a mess, jacket on wrong, no makeup, just raw panic. She didn't speak to me at first. She went straight to our daughter's side, brushed her hair gently, whispering her name like she was trying to wake her from a nightmare. Then, without looking at me, she said quietly, "I was stupid. I ruined everything." Our daughter's eyelids fluttered. She saw both of us standing there and mumbled, "Daddy, can Mommy stay?" I had no answer. I turned, walked into the hallway, and pressed my forehead to the wall. My fists clenched involuntarily. That one sentence from our daughter felt like being cut down the center. After a long breath, I walked back in and said, calm and even, "Stay, but only as her mom. Never again as my wife." Liana didn't fight it, just nodded, eyes brimming but silent. We stayed through the night, taking turns with compresses, sitting in that shared grief without touching it directly. By morning, the fever had broken. A nurse smiled. The worst had passed. Liana looked at me and whispered thanks like she was admitting defeat. I didn't respond. When we left the hospital, it felt like we'd crossed into new territory. Not reconciliation, just survival. We weren't partners, but we were both needed. We fell into a rhythm, separate homes, shared schedules, polite coordination. On the outside, people assumed we'd mended things, but they didn't see the divide, the cold spaces between words, or how I avoided her eyes. One afternoon, I began writing. Nothing formal, just a sentence on a page. For those who learn to stay silent. The words grew. I posted the first chapter on a small blog, anonymous. I didn't expect much, but it spread, fast. Messages flooded in. People thanked me, told me I'd written what they were too afraid to say. And one of them, a father from Florida, kept writing back. His story was worse, but familiar. We kept talking, and soon something unexpected took shape. Our kids, it turned out, loved the same games. What started as emails became something bigger. Out of pain, something new began. There's a strange kind of stillness that comes after chaos. Not peace exactly, more like the hum of a machine that doesn't stop, but no longer makes you flinch. That's how life felt for weeks after the hospital. Our daughter was healthy again, bouncing back with the endless resilience only kids seem to have. But the world around her, her parents, moved like two ghosts pretending to be whole. Liana and I became experts at surface calm. School drop-offs, shared calendars, short measured conversations that always circled the kids. We could stand at the same soccer game, cheer at the same goal, and never speak about anything beyond what time dinner should be. But even silence has weight, and ours was becoming harder to carry. I kept writing. The blog turned into a rhythm, a pulse I leaned on. People were still reading, still sharing, still reaching out. I hadn't used my real name, but somehow the words were truer than anything I'd ever said aloud. And one message in particular kept sticking with me. The father from Florida. His story was brutal, his divorce tangled in betrayal, manipulation, and courts that didn't listen. We started sending voice notes, talking late at night when the kids were asleep and the world finally stopped spinning. He mentioned an idea, something small at first. What if we started a weekend camp, he said, for kids from homes like ours, just a place for them to not feel like they're broken. It stuck with me for days. At the same time, something else stirred. Jane. She was the lead coach at the climbing gym. Former military, no nonsense, steady as stone. We'd been friendly since I joined the volunteer group. She'd started inviting me to lunch on training days. Quiet, simple meals eaten on the concrete steps behind the building, overlooking a field that was always just starting to bloom. There was never anything romantic between us, not really, but her presence had become grounding. She didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. She didn't fill the space with pity. She just showed up, and somehow that meant more than anyone's advice or concern ever had. Then came the day Liana showed up at the gym. She hadn't been there since the scene at the hospital. I was belaying one of the teens up a wall when I heard shouting by the front desk. I turned and saw her, flushed, waving a folded piece of paper. Some printed out email she must have found. It had the camp idea on it, the first version I'd sent to Florida. Somehow she thought it meant I was moving away, taking the kids, starting a new life without her. She was wrong, but she was unraveling. "You're doing this to punish me," she shouted, voice high and brittle. "You're trying to erase me." People stared. Jane walked over without a word, stood between us like a wall, calm as always. She didn't raise her voice. She just said, "This isn't the place." And that's when Liana slapped her. The crack echoed in the gym. Everything froze. Jane didn't flinch. She blinked once, jaw tightening. But she didn't retaliate. The staff called the police. When they arrived, they didn't ask many questions. Liana was taken in, just overnight, for public disturbance. But the message was clear. Her grasp on the illusion of control was slipping. That night, after the gym cleared out, I climbed alone. Just me, the harness, and the wall. I pushed harder than usual, reached a new personal record. When I came down, my arms shaking, Jane was sitting on the bench with 2 paper cups of coffee. She didn't say anything, just handed me one and sat beside me, both of us watching the moonlight stretch across the parking lot. She didn't need to say it. She knew I wasn't ready for anything new, and I respected her for not trying to make it something it wasn't. Back at home, the kids were asleep. I stood in the hallway listening to their breathing through the cracked doors, wondering how much they understood. Kids always know more than we want them to. I walked past my old room, now just storage, filled with leftover things from a life that no longer fit. Boxes of photos, mismatched mugs, a painting our son made when he was 3. I sat on the floor and started writing again. This time, it wasn't about betrayal, it was about rebuilding. And it started with this line: "You can survive the fire, but you won't come out the same shape." There are seasons that don't announce themselves. They don't blow in with storms or melt in spring rains. They just shift quietly. One day you wake up and it's no longer winter inside you. That's what happened, though I didn't recognize it at first. The house I rented was still too quiet, the air too still. but I'd stopped waiting for noise. Every morning I got up before the sun, made breakfast for the kids, and walked them to school holding one on each side. Our daughter liked to count the cracks in the sidewalk. Our son liked to jump over them. I didn't tell them how much I depended on that routine, how each little habit was another plank on the bridge I was building back to myself. I wasn't in love with my life, but I was starting to feel something like peace. I didn't go back to teaching. I wasn't ready to stand in front of a classroom pretending I hadn't lost something. Instead, I started working at the local school as a project assistant, fixing what needed fixing, filling in where others wouldn't. They called me Mr. Eric, even though I had no title. But I had hands that worked and a calm that helped. That was enough. Every Sunday, I took the kids to a local farm. It was run by a friend of my dad's, old guy named Wendell, who wore the same denim shirt every week and could fix anything with a pocket knife and duct tape. He let the kids help feed the goats and chase chickens around the pen. More importantly, he let me tinker in the shed. We started fixing up an old tractor, sanding rust and replacing parts until it started to resemble something useful again. I didn't realize how much I needed that place until one Sunday I stood in the barn, greasy hands on the engine block, and thought, this is the most I've breathed all week. Liana still tried in her own way. She sent letters, not emails, but actual envelopes, always sealed in red ink. I didn't open them. She dropped off a box of old family photos at my parents' house. I left it untouched. She once waited outside the daycare until the director asked her to leave. There was no fight left in me, but there was no door either. For every betrayal, for every silent night I spent staring at the ceiling in that cold rented bedroom, I answered not with anger, but with motion. I showed up for the kids. I picked up tools. I cleared broken brush. I gave my time to others who didn't have anyone. I wasn't building a new life out of spite. I was building it because the old one couldn't hold weight anymore. Jane stayed in the background, steady as ever. She came to the farm one Sunday to help repair a corroded windmill. The kids liked her, especially my daughter, who thought Jane was some kind of superhero. They'd walk side by side, matching strides like they'd done it for years. Jane never pushed. She never blurred the lines. And maybe that's why I started to notice how much I looked forward to seeing her. One night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself scrolling through messages on the blog. Dozens of new voices had joined the thread. Parents, mostly. Some were still married, some separated, some barely hanging on. They weren't looking for advice. They just wanted someone to listen. One message stopped me cold. It was from a teenage girl in Illinois. She wrote about how her parents screamed behind closed doors, how she pretended not to hear. She wrote about how her dad used to smile, but hadn't in months. I read your words out loud to him, she wrote. He didn't say anything, but the next day he made breakfast for the first time in a year. That night I stayed up until 2 a.m., drafting something new. Florida Dad, his name was Mark, called it The Start. The official name of the program wasn't perfect, but it worked. Camp Lantern, a place for kids from fractured homes, kids stuck between court visits and weekend bags and unsaid things. We filed paperwork, set up a small site. Word spread fast. Some people offered donations. Some offered land. A retired teacher from Oregon said she'd drive cross-country just to help. And just like that, something bigger than pain started taking shape. Meanwhile, I noticed something strange. Liana had stopped showing up. No more daycare appearances. No more letters. Even her messages grew less frequent, shorter. At first, I thought maybe she'd just grown tired of trying. But then I found out from her sister that she'd taken a new job out of state. 3 hours south, in a town no one in our family had ever even visited. The move wasn't permanent, not yet, but it was the first time she'd voluntarily stepped back. No more begging, no more bargaining, just quiet, and I didn't know how to feel about that. One Saturday afternoon, I stood at the edge of the field with Jane, watching the kids run around with kites. The sun was low, the kind that makes the grass look like gold. Jane glanced at me and said, "You look taller lately." I laughed. "That's just the boots." But we both knew what she meant. You don't always notice when the wound becomes a scar. There's no sound, no moment of clarity. Just one day you brush your hand over that old hurt and realize it no longer makes you flinch. That's how it felt the morning I saw Liana again. After weeks of silence, after months of barely controlled chaos. She didn't call ahead. She just showed up outside the school, standing near the bike rack in a crisp blazer and boots too new for the gravel. I was helping the kids load into my car when I saw her. She didn't wave, just nodded once. She looked different, not older, but less polished, like someone who'd spent time alone with her thoughts and hadn't liked what she found. She asked if she could talk, not in front of the kids. So we stood behind the school gym, a place where kids wrote their names in chalk and first crushes happened when no one was looking. She didn't apologize. Not this time. She just said, "I think you've done better without me. That's hard to admit." I waited. Then she added, "The job down south? I'm taking it full time. I'll visit the kids every other weekend if you'll allow it. I just can't pretend anymore." There was no speech in me, no forgiveness, just a quiet kind of surprise. I'd expected her to keep clinging, to try reshaping the past until it fit her needs. But instead, she was backing away, for real this time, on her own. We worked out a schedule. It was clinical, clean, 2 weekends a month, alternating holidays, shared custody on paper, but practically speaking, the house and the rhythm stayed with me. She left that day with a faint smile and eyes that looked grateful, not for me, but for the chance to finally let go. That night I made grilled cheese with the kids and let them stay up late to watch a nature documentary. When they asked about Mommy's new town, I showed them a map, drew a little heart over it. My daughter asked if there were mountains there. I said no, but lots of lakes. She nodded, satisfied. Days started blending into weeks again, but this time they weren't heavy. The routine didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like structure. I stopped avoiding mirrors. I started sleeping all the way through the night. Jane came by on Thursdays now, sometimes to help fix the fence, sometimes just to sit with the kids and read. One morning I found a letter in the mailbox, not from Liana, but from her sister. It was short, just one sentence. I didn't know what she was doing until it was already done. There was no return address. I didn't respond. I didn't want to relive the beginning again. I wasn't interested in excavating guilt from someone who hadn't spoken up when it mattered. The past had been heavy enough the first time. I had no intention of dragging it behind me now. Instead, I leaned harder into Camp Lantern. Mark and I started planning the first official session, a 3-day pilot program over the fall break. We secured a cabin site in Utah, got permits, arranged gear donations from outdoor suppliers. The first batch of kids was small, 12 total, but each one came with a story no one else had really listened to. That first day, I watched a boy named Chase, age 10, quiet, wore his hoodie even in the sun, walk up to a rope course and freeze halfway up. He didn't cry. He didn't back down either. He just held there, hands shaking, breathing fast. I climbed up beside him and said nothing, just stayed close. After 10 minutes, he moved. One step, then another. He reached the platform. He smiled. That's when I knew this mattered, that something good had finally grown out of the wreckage. Later that night, as the kids roasted marshmallows over the fire, Mark handed me his phone. He'd pulled up the blog. The newest comments were from parents thanking us, asking when the next camp would be. But one stood out. It was from Liana, not by name. She'd used initials, but I recognized her voice instantly. Some wounds aren't visible. Some are shaped like absence. If you ever read this, thank you for keeping the light on for our kids, even when I was the one who cut the power. I sat with that for a long time. Didn't reply. Didn't need to. I wasn't angry anymore. But I wasn't hers anymore either. The next morning, the sky cracked open with a sudden downpour. The kids screamed with joy and ran through the mud, kicking up laughter like it was the only language they knew. I watched from the cabin porch, arms folded, heart full in a way I didn't think I'd feel again. Behind me, Jane said, "You ever think you'd get here?" "No," I admitted, "but I'm not leaving." She didn't answer, just smiled, turned back toward the storm. Only one part of the story still waited to be written. It didn't end with thunder, no final confrontation, no slammed doors or shouted truths. The last chapter of what we were faded out in the most unexpected way. Soft, almost unnoticed, like a house going dark one room at a time. And maybe that was the point. Not all endings come with warning shots. Some just drift into silence when they've served their purpose. The last camp session of the year wrapped at the edge of a frozen lake. 12 kids, 3 volunteers, 1 battered school bus, and a fire that refused to die, even with snow in the trees. I watched them carry their own sleeping bags, joke about burnt oatmeal, and draw constellations in the sky with sticks. No one needed me to explain what this place had become. It was written all over their faces, the relief, the trust, the feeling that this cabin, these woods, these strangers, had given them something their own homes couldn't. One boy, Miles, age 9, stood beside me after breakfast and said, "I wish my real life was this quiet." I looked out over the lake. Sometimes it can be. He didn't say anything back, but his hand found mine without asking. When the kids went home, the silence left behind wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Jane and I stayed behind to clean the cabins, restock supplies, and make plans for spring. There was no defining moment where things between us shifted. No first kiss under the stars. It happened like the rest of my healing. Quiet, patient, almost invisible until it was permanent. She started coming over for Sunday dinners. My daughter braided her hair. My son asked her to play cards. And I noticed I didn't feel guilt for smiling anymore. Liana's visits with the kids became routine. She'd pick them up on Fridays, return them Sunday evening. I kept it polite. No small talk. Just handoffs and bags and reminders about math homework. She never lingered. And for that, I was grateful. Then came the call that pulled it all forward again. Late March, early spring storm rolling in. My daughter's voice shaky on the phone. "Daddy." Mommy fell. The ER was crowded. Wet floors, white lights. I found them in the back. A twisted ankle, bruised wrist, nothing life-threatening. But Liana looked shaken. The way she gripped the hospital blanket with both hands told me she wasn't scared of pain. She was scared of what almost happened in front of her daughter. Vulnerability, exposed without warning. She asked for a moment alone. I didn't want to give it, but I did. She told me about her new apartment, how she slept on a couch most nights, how the walls were thin and the heater wheezed. She talked about missing the kids' routines, the rhythm of bedtime, the soft thud of little feet across hardwood. Then she asked the question I thought I'd never hear again. Can I come back, not as your wife, just as someone who's trying to be better? I looked at her for a long time. The woman who once laughed in another man's car, who let silence stretch between us like a wire pulled tight. The woman who once left a box of jewelry tags under our bed, still smelling like someone else's cologne. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging, just asking. And maybe that's why I didn't hate her anymore. But forgiveness and reunion aren't the same thing. One is a gift, the other is a decision. I shook my head slowly. You can be their mother. You already are. That's enough. She nodded. Just once. And this time, it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace. We left the hospital quietly. I buckled our daughter into her seat, watched Liana disappear into a rideshare, and drove home in the soft hush of falling sleet. That night, as I tucked my daughter in, she looked up and whispered, "You're my favorite parent." I smiled, kissed her forehead, and whispered back, "That's a pretty good deal." Weeks passed, then months. Camp Lantern reopened in May, bigger now, with a second location on the coast. Mark flew out for the launch and we finally met face to face. He brought his daughter, a quiet, artistic teen who immediately bonded with my son over board games and marshmallow engineering. We stood on the beach watching them build an absurd sandcastle with a drawbridge, and he said, "Crazy how this all started with pain." I nodded. That's the thing about pain. It either wrecks you or rebuilds you. Depends on what you do with the pieces. Back home, Jane and I painted the kids' bedrooms. I let them choose the colors, neon green and sky blue. She helped hang glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and we stood back admiring the mess we'd made. I didn't ask her to stay over. She didn't need an invitation anymore. We just existed, side by side, like two people who understood that love isn't a flash. It's a slow burn that survives the storm. One afternoon, I opened that old box Liana had left behind at my parents' house. Photos, drawings, a lock of hair, a birthday card I'd forgotten I ever received. I flipped through the memories with a calm heart. No anger, no longing, just a deep, unshakable knowing that the man in those photos was gone. But in his place stood someone stronger. Not harder, just clearer. I didn't throw anything away, but I didn't keep them either. I brought the box to a small bridge over the creek behind the farm. Said nothing. Let the wind decide where the pages landed. Then I walked home. Not to a perfect life, but to my life. The one I built nail by nail, day by day. For the first time in forever, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That's all for now, folks. Thank you for being with me today and listened. And if you liked my story, please subscribe, hit the like button, and comment below what you think about all this and what would you do if you were me. Also, don't forget to check my other stories in description below.